Okay, we're going to talk about agent-based modeling for a while. I am not going to monitor the chat during the first time, the first period. If people who are watching asynchronously have a comment, um, and it's pressing, just unmute yourself and go, "Hey, Paul," and I'll stop and answer anything. Um, I will also stop for a break halfway through each session, the morning session, the afternoon session, or the session one and session two, whatever, of each day, um, so that people can take care of business and I can address any questions that come up in the chat there either. Okay. Like Steve said, this is sort of a discipline-free thing, or I'm very interdisciplinary. I like to give a little bio of who I am, just to help people understand where I'm coming from and the perspectives that I bring here. And you're going to bring your own perspectives and different expectations, and hopefully those can align as best as possible. So this is what I call a brief visual CV. I did an undergrad degree in physics. I did graduate degrees in psychology, cogneuro, and also psychobiology, which featured a lot of animal behavior. I did a lot of shenanigans in between undergrad and grad school. I had a lot of jobs, worked as an immunology lab tech, worked in a recording studio, worked in film, worked as a copy editor, worked as a psychiatric nurse's aide. And I went back to school. I did my degree. I did several postdocs, one in a school of medicine, one in the Department of Anthropology, and one that was cross-listed between political science and computer science. Then I managed to land a faculty job at UC Merced in the Department of Cognitive and Information Sciences. I'm also a member of the Quantitative and Systems Biology grad group. I'm a member of the Center for Analytic Political Engagement and Interdisciplinary Neuroscience. Those are two centers at UCM. And I'm also external faculty at the Santa Fe Institute, which is kind of an interdisciplinary center for complex systems research. And like Steve said, I wrote a book. This was just published in October. This course is going to be a very sort of highlights tour, not highlights tour, a sampling of some of the things that are covered in much more depth in this book. I teach a 15-week course at UC Merced on agent-based modeling, or modeling more general, and this is going to be highly concentrated what we do. Okay. I like to start things off with a quote, as so many people do. This is from Jakob von Uexküll, who was a sort of naturalist and an early scientist in Germany in the first half of the 20th century. Did a lot of work in what became ethology. And this was from his book. I'm going to mangle the German. Umwelt and Innenwelt der Tier. The truth lies directly before us in the reality surrounding us. However, we cannot use it as it is. An unbroken description of reality would be simultaneously the truest and most useless thing in the world, and it would certainly not be science. If we want to make reality, and therefore truth, useful to science, we must do violence to reality. We must introduce the distinction, which does not exist in nature, between essential and inessential. In nature, everything is equally essential. By seeking out the relationships that seem essential to us, we order the material in a surveyable way at the same time. Then we are doing science. I love this quote. To me, it's like very fundamental to the way I see what the task of science is, which is to break the world into recognizable and delineatable parts and express things about properties of the relationships between those parts. So I'm going to get a little sort of introductory right now and talk a bit about the philosophy of the course before we get into the mechanical details of agent-based modeling. It's going to get a little philosophical for a little bit, but rest assured it will be very technical soon after and for the rest of the course. But I think a background is in order. So this is a murmuration of starlings. All those little tiny black dots are starlings, which are small birds. And they get together in these groups of often tens of thousands, even occasionally hundreds of thousands. And the thing moves as a coherent unit. This is something many of you may have seen, either with starlings or something else. This is a video of the murmurations happening, and you can see they move in this kind of incredibly coherent way. This is often used as almost an archetypal example of emergent phenomena, right? Emergent being there's a level at which we can express a thing that doesn't require us to talk about its component parts. We can talk about the flock or the herd or whatever without necessarily knowing and understanding what the individual parts are doing. But it's a real question what these individual parts are doing. How do these birds do this coherently? And if you look at the history of thinking about things like flocking and swarming and schooling, you see a lot of interesting explanations. There were people proposing as late as the 1960s and beyond that birds had psychic powers or telepathy, that there was maybe a leader bird that could communicate to all the birds and tell them what to do. But it doesn't seem to be that way. And one of the earliest sort of scientific coherent explanations came actually not from someone trained in biology, but from someone trained in computer science. So in 1987, Craig Reynolds, who was a computer scientist working at Sony in the computer graphics division, Reynolds worked on the original Tron, if that resonates with anyone, was trying to come up with a way to basically program a computational model that would capture things that looked like birds flocking, fish schooling, etc. And so he wanted to see, like, what would it take for an individual bird, or an individual anything, to create, if every individual had some heuristic or some set of principles that guided their behavior, and each responded locally, could we get something that looked like the flocking that we see? And so he called this model Boids, which is sort of a joke on the way people from Philadelphia pronounce the word birds, and created a scenario in which agents embedded in a 2D or a 3D space could respond locally to their local environment, moved generally forward, had a direction and propelled themselves forward, but used these rules to decide where to turn and how to turn. And just 3 rules. One is separation. So he said, all right, well, birds don't crash into each other. So they can see each other and they want to avoid crashing. So let's assume that there is a separation principle where if you're going to crash, you turn away so you don't crash. Okay, once you've avoided crashing, and you're not worried about that, the next rule takes hold, alignment. Birds are social. They generally have shared goals if they're all part of a flock, at least in terms of things like predator avoidance and often in terms of food scavenging, although there's some conflicts of interest there too. And so the second rule is look around you, see where everyone else is going, and turn generally toward the average alignment, the average direction of every other bird. All right, that's going to get them all locally moving in the same direction. But remember, it's not the whole flock that sees everyone else. Each bird is only seeing the birds that are immediately around it or even immediately within its eyesight, just the ones that are close to it. And you can have a really big flock where birds on one part don't see the other. And the last is cohesion, which is that if you get too far away from any other birds, you just kind of move in the direction where the most birds are. And when you see these 3, they can do kind of amazing things. I'm not going to do a lot of prepared videos in this, but I really like this demonstration.
So the first rule here is alignment. And, I'll just put a bunch of guys out here for fun. So what each Boyd does is it looks to its neighbors, its friends, in kind of a small radius, maybe about 2 or 3 body lengths, as long as they are now. And it averages the position of all of its friends' headings, right, the direction that they're facing. And it moves a little bit towards that direction. So if all of its friends are looking to the left, it turns a little bit towards the left. And every Boyd does that for every other Boyd that's in that little radius of its friends group. So if I turn that off, you'll see they just kind of go everywhere. They don't really have a reason to go in any one direction or another. Now there's some other rules. Obviously you can see they like to be near each other. And that's the second rule. There's a cohesion rule. They take that same grouping, that same radius around themselves of friends, and average their positions. They say, okay, for all the Boyds around me, roughly where's the center of all of them? And then they seek towards that a little bit. So there's also a balancing force against that. If they get too close to all the other Boyds that are near them, they back away, they avoid crowding. So you can see these look pretty realistic to maybe little fish swimming around. They like to be near each other, but not so near. But because they don't care about what direction they're facing right now, since I've turned off alignment, they just kind of flit around. And as soon as I turn that back on, suddenly it looks like they have a purpose. They're swimming fast, And you can see that group just reformed with another group. So those are the 3 rules. And I can turn these things off at will here. If we turn off crowding rule, they'll get really, really close together. They want to be near each other and they want to copy each other's heading. So they formed into just a line. If I turn that back on, they'll puff back out. And there's some other stuff going on here. They have, they have some noise. If I turn off the noise, they're pretty smooth. And if I turn it back on, you can see them kind of jiggle. So if I turn off all of the rules here, now they're fully random and they don't care about each other at all. If I turn off the noise, they just kind of drift. They still care about getting away from the barriers here on the edge. And in fact, I can come in here and turn these rules back on and lay down a bunch of barriers for them to avoid, and lay down a bunch more Boyds, and you'll see lots of interesting stuff happen. They avoid areas, stick back together, all sorts of stuff.
Okay. So this is an agent-based model. That one is done in a language called processing, which is based in JavaScript. It's also free. That's not what we're going to use in the course, but it is a cool language to play around with, especially if you're interested in doing any kind of web embeddings or very visual stuff. It's really keyed in toward very cool visualizations. So I'll talk more about what agent-based modeling is and the different kinds of uses for it, but that's a sort of early example. Boyd's is actually extremely influential as an algorithm. Turns out that movies and video games and TV have benefited immensely from Boyd's. Basically, anytime if you're watching a cartoon or something with CGI and you see some sort of herd or stampede or swarm or school of fish, the movement of those creatures is done using some variation on Boyd's. This is actually a brief clip from the very first use of the Boyd's algorithm in a major motion picture. I'm sorry if this re-traumatizes anyone from their childhood, if anyone was a Disney kid. But you can see in the long shots, all these wildebeests, the movement of them is Boyd's, and then they have the wildebeests drawn over them. All right. Yeah, I mean, so this is used all the time. Like if you watch a big movie like The Lord of the Rings or anything with these giant battle scenes or huge swarms, those aren't 10,000 extras that they got in costume and reenacted a giant battle scene. Usually, they are for the close-up so that the more detailed shots. They're computer creatures, and the programmers didn't program every single individual to do a very specific choreographed set of movements. That would be, it would take forever. You couldn't do it. Instead, what you do is come up with a set of rules for individual behaviors and put individuals in a simulated environment where they can respond to each other, and you look at the things that come up. Now, I talked about this use in industry, but things like Boids have been extremely useful for people actually trying to understand crowd behavior, swarm behavior, both in animal behavior, fish, birds, etc., and also human crowds, traffic, etc. These kinds of principles of collective behavior have been really inspired and make great application of these kinds of spatial agent-based modeling. And these kinds of simulations are used throughout the sciences at various levels of description, of fine-grained detail, of abstraction. The space of possibilities for creating agent-based models is just extremely, extremely vast. And we're going to cover a very small amount of that, but I really want to make sure that we also have time once we go through this to talk about any concerns from any of the people watching this course of your specific fields and the kinds of questions you're hoping to bring to agent-based modeling. So I'm going to briefly lay out sort of the goals of the course. The main one is just developing technical skills and learning how to think like a modeler, to sort of understand how models work, how they can be used, what models done by other people can help tell us, and how to use models in our own research to further the kinds of questions and thinking that we want to think about. And there's a lot of core concepts in the science of what's sometimes called complex systems or complexity science that come to bear on this, and I'll be talking about that. The space of possible models is, like I said, just too vast. It would be a disservice to do a survey of all of them. So I've had to pick a small family of models, and I've used contagion models, both because they're very straightforward. There's a lot of research on them. They're fun, they're topical, they are used not only in the biological sciences like epidemiology, but also in the social sciences for things like the diffusion of innovation and the diffusion of products and ideas, etc. So we'll use these. We'll talk about different ways to model agent interactions. We'll talk about both spatially structured models, network structured models, and a lot of the lessons will extend to many other systems. And at the end, I'll conclude with a discussion of how to build models of any system. So hopefully that all makes sense. So the outline works roughly like this. So today, in the course is divided into 3 units. That's this unit. We're in unit 1, right? I'll start out just talking about models, agent-based and otherwise. Once I get through this introduction, we'll talk about NetLogo. NetLogo is the software/programming language that we're going to use for the course. It's probably the most widely used platform for doing agent-based modeling. I'm going to mess around with some spatial models with mobile agents, getting agents to, creating agents in a two-dimensional space and having them move around and interact. And we'll talk about how to analyze outcomes with those models. In Unit 2, we'll get more detail. We'll talk about cellular automata models, really introduce contagion models, think about how to model interventions once we have a contagion model there, and get into more detail on how to analyze agent-based models. And finally, in Unit 3, we'll go into network models. There's lots of different kinds of structures you can have for a population. Networks, I think, are one of the many strengths of agent-based modeling. We'll model both simple and complex contagion models on networks. And then we'll talk about how to integrate these kinds of models and other models with empirical research programs, talking about the relationship between these theoretical models and data, and then building your own models. For those watching synchronously, this is roughly 1 unit per day, but the mapping isn't always one-to-one. I might finish a unit early and start the next one, or I might take a little longer on a unit and then start it the next day. This is a technical class, right? Agent-based modeling, it does involve programming. You can get very fancy. All the math that I'm going to use is very straightforward high school math, algebra, functions, basic probability. Anyone working in any kind of research should have no problem with any of that. So if you can parse an equation like this, where this is a recursion, where the value of I at time t plus 1 is equal to a function of the value of I at time t, you should have no problem. If that is confusing to you, then don't worry, we'll go slow. And there's not that much math here. You can do a lot more math with modeling, but I've kept this fairly straightforward. Mostly to focus on the agent-based component. We're going to do programming. A lot of the students will have a lot of programming experience. Some people will have less programming experience. That's okay. We're going to use NetLogo. It is, I'd say, one of the most learnable languages, in part because its syntax is designed to look as much like natural language as possible. And we'll go through it a bit. It is helpful to know some of these things, but I will go sort of very briefly review them today. So things like variables, conditionals, loops, concepts like object-oriented programming, and any data visualization skills you might have. So NetLogo code often looks like this, very sort of familiar, almost looks like pseudocode, setting up a function, if-then statements, etc. Okay, practical matters. The lectures will be recorded, obviously. The second session of each unit are going to focus a bit more on working through some of the homework problems I've uploaded to the Google Drive, which you all have access to. All the code used in the class is up there, and you can grab it. So I would say maybe during the first break, if you haven't already, it might be easy to just download all that code and just grab it so that you have it at the ready. Also, I've just created some homework problems. These are just exercises to help us sort of get a little bit deeper, and I'll help go through some of those with some of the extra time in the afternoon sessions. I'll focus more on lecturing during the first half. I've put up some readings. The readings are all optional. They're just supplemental. But if you're interested in this kind of thing, some of them are things written by me, some of them things written by others. Using NetLogo, you benefit a lot from looking at the user's manual and especially the tutorials. I've encouraged people to work through the tutorials in advance, but if you haven't, that's okay, but I do recommend doing them. All the slides are provided in those folders as well, so you don't have to do any screen captures. You can just grab all these slides. And the homework is important. Whether you do the exact assignments that I've made or other things, I mean, like any technical skill, right? The way to get better is practice and trying to do things that are different than the things you've been taught, or that are, sort of extending or variations on the things that you've been taught. And we'll work through some of those together. Okay. So we're going to talk a lot about models. When I talk about models, I mean something pretty specific. Obviously not fashion models or anything, and also something a little bit different than the statistical models that people are used to thinking about, although there is a connection with those. Models are any structures which can be abstract or physical that potentially represent a real world phenomena. So they can be physical models, and they can be animal models, they can be experimental models, as well as formal models, mathematical or computational models. So engineers might use physical models. This is a picture of the San Francisco Bay model. This is in Sausalito, California, a couple hours from where I am right now. This is about 3 acres, or about 0.01 square kilometers. And it is roughly to scale. The actual space is about 1,200 square kilometers. It's a physical model of the entire San Francisco Bay. And this was built in the 1950s and 60s by the US Army Corps of Engineers, basically to assess repercussions of damming projects, whether or not to dam parts of the bay or any of the inlets. The whole thing is very complex, and just by surveying the land, it wasn't clear to the engineers what the consequences of building certain dams were. So they built this model to see what would happen to things like water levels. And they ended up deciding that it would be a bad idea, and they didn't build any dams. But this thing is still available. It's still existing and available, open to the public. Obviously, engineers build scale models, physical models all the time, right? Bridges, machines, prototypes that are versions, simplified versions of the real thing to look at some of the principles. But models can be a little bit more squishy, both figuratively and literally, right? Biomedical researchers, behavioral researchers, neuroscientists use animal models all the time to make, most researchers who study things like Norway rats and fruit flies are not interested per se in the physiology or behavior of Norway rats or fruit flies. Some of them are, but most of them aren't. Right? Instead, they're interested in general principles, often about humans, about physiology, hormones, neuroscience, behavior of these organisms, genetics, and they use the inferences drawn from what they learn about these animals to make analogies about the real system, about the systems, the larger classes of systems. And this is, I think, fundamental about models. Like a model is, this is an idea I kind of took from the philosopher Michael Weisberg, but the difference between a modeler and a non-modeler is really just whether or not you're studying the thing that you're ultimately interested in, or you're studying something else because it's difficult to study the real thing. You study something else that's similar enough that then you can draw inferences back to the thing you're interested in. And so animal models are like this, and experiments are models. So this is sort of a famous experimental paradigm from psychology. This is the marshmallow test. Many people have heard about this. Interpretations exactly of what this tests are contentious these days in psychology. But basically what it is, if you don't know it, is you bring a child into a room and you put a marshmallow in front of them, and then you say, I'm going to leave the room for a while. And if that marshmallow is still there when I come back, I'll give you a second marshmallow. And you can have 2 marshmallows. But if it's eaten, then you don't get a second marshmallow. And this used to be thought to measure something like, willpower or fortitude or grit. And now it's thought that it more likely measures things like trust in authority and feelings of safety, which co-vary a lot with social and economic status. But regardless, right, pretty much nobody who's doing this study is interested in how long it takes how long a child can wait for a marshmallow. That would be crazy if you're like, my thesis is on how long kids can wait to eat marshmallows because that's what I really want to know about. Maybe somebody does. But really they're interested in a much larger class of behaviors. So the experiment is a model for the kinds of phenomena that those researchers are interested in. Now, formal models are like this too. Formal models are user-defined sets of specifications of parts and relationships between parts that represent some system. And I think of them as really continuous with these other kinds of things, whereas an engineer can build a physical model, or other kinds of scientists find or construct ways, aspects of the natural world to better represent or more clearly represent the kinds of systems or phenomena they're interested in. Modelers can also say, well, I'm just going to construct a purely hypothetical scenario and say, these are the parts and these are their properties and these are their rules for change. And I think that this scenario represents something in the world. We set out a set of assumptions that we think are correct or accurate, or we have good reason to think so, or we are testing. And then we see what the logical conclusions or the mathematically necessary conclusions of those assumptions are. And that's what formal modeling is. And agent-based modeling is a kind of formal modeling. These models are basically a logical engine for turning assumptions into conclusions. And we need these engines because our minds are limited. It's really hard for us to think through the consequences of hundreds or thousands of moving parts all interacting with each other over a long time. If we could do that, we wouldn't need to make simulation models. We could just simulate it in our brains. But we usually can't. Although as you do this, you do get better at drawing inferences or getting intuitions for the way these kinds of systems tend to work. But by building the agent-based models explicitly, we create what Murray Gell-Mann has called a prosthesis for the imagination. We can get a lot out of this, right? If you ask most people why you should model, most people will say prediction. Prediction seems to be the gold standard of a good, successful science, right? We want to be able to predict things. Prediction is great, but models don't always need to predict. You can get other things from models that are really useful without doing any prediction. One is precision, just knowing exactly what we're talking about, especially when dealing with complex systems, especially social or behavioral systems where we primarily use language to describe what's going on, right? Language is inherently vague and ambiguous. 2-3 people can use the same words about things, and when you actually press them for what they mean, turns out they were thinking of something very different. By formalizing hypotheses and theories, everyone can know exactly what everyone else is talking about. We can all know that we're thinking about the same system, and we can all agree on what its strengths and weaknesses are. And I think this really helps out with the accumulation of theoretical results. Relatedly, right, models provide tractability. The real world is hard, right? We can't always do the kinds of experiments we want. There are limitations of time and space and resources and ethics that we can't like infect everyone in a population and see what happens, right? We can't put an apex predator into a population and just see what happens. But we could build a model of what kinds of things we might expect if such a scenario was to arise. And we can create a tractable, analyzable system that would be very difficult to study in the real world. And I think that just generally, there's a lot of insight you can get from doing these kinds of models. Not just from any specific model, but over time, when you build models and you analyze them over and over again, you get an intuition for the kinds of dynamics and the kinds of relationships that occur over and over again across systems. This is actually, I think, one of the basic gambit of what's now called complex systems or complexity science, which is the idea that across levels of organization and different kinds of systems, from galaxies to neurons to ecosystems to social systems, there are principles about the kinds of dynamics and relationships that occur when certain relationships exist. And those relationships exist often in some form across many systems. And building models, so much insight in science has basically stemmed from somebody in one field familiar with the models of their field entering a new field and saying, hey, this thing in this field is like this other thing in my other field, and I can either bring wholesale or adapt a model. Contagion models, which we'll cover, are a great example, right? First developed in epidemiology, later used to describe product adoption and the diffusion of innovations, then even later used to study things like the spread of ideas and behaviors. Okay. I like to give a parable. I call this the parable of the Cubist chicken. We'll get to the nitty-gritty details very soon, but I want to really drive this point home. Right? This is something that happened to me years and years ago when I was in college, so it was over 2 decades ago. But I was an undergraduate, and I was with a friend, and we went to basically get a third friend of ours to go out and have fun at night. And this third friend of ours was in a play. He was an actor in a play. And we had seen the play the night before, so we went to just collect him after the play. But we got there a little early, so we went into the basement of the theater at the university. And there was a bunch of stuff. If you've ever been in a university theater, there's just a bunch of random knickknacks. And there was a bucket of Legos. And we started just putting random Legos together while we were talking. And one of us said, I don't even know who, said, hey, look, it's like a Cubist chicken. And I promise you we were not sober. But one of us said, it's like a Cubist chicken. And immediately the other one of us was like, yeah, it's a Cubist chicken. And we were just like unreasonably proud of ourselves for agreeing that this was a Cubist chicken. We talked about the Cubist chicken for several minutes, and then we put it down. A few minutes later, our friend comes down from his play, and we hold it up to him and say, hey, look, a Cubist chicken. And this image is not exactly what it looked like. This is like an artist's reconstruction, but I don't know, it was something like this. Some just like mashing together of white and black and yellow and red Legos. And if you kind of squinted, it kind of looked vaguely like a chicken. And he said, how is that a Cubist chicken? And I was like, well, okay, here's the head, and here's the neck, and this is the body, and these are the feet. And my friend, who, again, for 10 minutes had been totally agreeing with me that it was a Cubist chicken, got very upset and was like, no, the whole thing is just the head, and this is the crest, and this is the beak, and these are the eyes. And we realized that we'd been using the same term to talk about the same thing and agreeing that we agreed for 10 minutes. And it was only when we had to really be specific about what we meant that we realized we had a completely different interpretation of what those words meant. And we were envisioning the system completely differently. And I think this kind of thing, it really stuck with me because I think in language and in life, this kind of thing happens all the time. That actually this is an adaptive feature of language. The ambiguity allows us to imagine that we agree often more than we really do. And it's probably a useful thing for a lot of coalition building and cooperation. But it's not great when we're trying to do science and trying to be really precise and say exactly what we mean. Right? So formalism helps us avoid this issue by allowing us to unambiguously say exactly what we're talking about when we talk about our ideas for some system. Okay, how do we build a system? How to model system, right? We have to break it down into parts, right? So if we want to understand the behavior of some system, we have to articulate that system. We have to decompose it and say, okay, what are the parts? What are their properties? What are the relationships between the parts? And how do those properties and relationships change? Now, this gets back exactly to that quote by von Uexküll I talked about at the beginning, right? Any system you're interested in can be described in many different ways. It is what it is. It has all the features of itself, and you can't take away any of them and leave the whole system intact, really. But that's not actually what we're doing when we're doing science. We don't care about the nature, usually, we don't care about the full nature of a system. We care about understanding some aspect of the system because we're interested in certain kinds of outcomes. And so what we need to do when we build up theories and hypotheses about those systems and the outcomes we're interested in is delineate what are the aspects, what are the parts of the system that are essential to our theory for that outcome, for that behavior, for that phenomenon. What are the parts that are essential that we require in our theory to understand what's happening? And what are the parts that are less important? And of those parts, what properties are important and what parts can we ignore? What relationships are important and what relationships do we ignore? And how do these properties and relationships change over time? And what's really frustrating is that the decomposition that's useful to you is going to depend on the questions you're trying to answer. There is no one right way to decompose a system because the system is the system. And any decomposition is an abstraction and ultimately a debasement of that system. But it's the decomposition that is useful to you. To answer your question, I actually think this is like my pet philosophy theory here. You don't have to take this very seriously, but like Thomas Kuhn in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions talks a lot about paradigms and paradigm shifts and how scientists work under paradigms, which are basically sets of assumptions about a system. And those assumptions, I think this is really related to this, where certain paradigms facilitate or afford certain kinds of decompositions, which allow us to ask certain kinds of questions usefully and not others. And a paradigm shift happens often when a new decomposition is introduced that allows us to ask new or better questions or get better answers to the questions that we want to know. Knowing some common decompositions is useful. It helps drive theory forward as we build on each other's decomposition. If we say this is a common decomposition for understanding contagion or cooperation or segregation or any other kinds of phenomena, we can say, well, okay, first of all, we have a lingua franca where we can all talk about the same thing. And also it allows us to build on it and extend it forward. So that's the gambit I'm going to take, which is to say, I think there are certain decompositions that have proven themselves useful. They're always wrong at some level, but they capture, I think, some aspect of systems that I think are important and valuable toward moving forward. And I do think, though, before I move on, right, the question really does determine the relevant parts of the system. And it works the other way too, right? How we model a system determines the questions that we can ask about it. And so it's useful not to get too comfortable with any particular model, or at least to constantly or at least periodically ask ourselves, what are the kinds of questions that this model doesn't allow us to ask? This is economists sometimes, so the behavioral economists have sometimes called this model-based blindness, when people are sort of so focused on the models that they're using that they stop relating it back to the aspects of reality that don't fit the model. And that is a problem. We can talk more about that toward the end. We're going to take a go forward, but I want to highlight one example here. So this is a real example. This is from when I got this when I was at a Santa Fe Institute workshop on computational modeling about 15 or 16 years ago that John Miller and Scott Page ran. And they started the workshop with this prompt. They said, people enter and leave an elevator as it travels up and down. Model using whatever techniques you wish, the above scenario, and explicitly state your model and key assumptions. Now, as a naive grad student, I thought, well, okay, great. We were in groups. We started talking about the scenario, people entering and leaving an elevator. And my group said, okay, well, let's do something like make it a decision-making problem. So individuals get to the elevator. They're on some floor, they need to get to a different floor. They have the choice between taking the elevator or walking up and down the stairs. And so this has to do with sort of how many flights of stairs they need to traverse and what time of day it is, so how crowded the elevator is likely to be and how long it's likely to take. And so we kind of created terms for all these things and looked at how it might vary depending on different other features, like time of day or flight, floor, or sort of maybe individual traits like shyness. And then we presented this to the group, and then another group gave their presentation, and their presentation was totally different. Their presentation was, imagine people in an elevator. You're in an elevator, and what you want to do, it's also a decision-making task, but an individual, what you want is to be as close to the door as possible when it's time to leave the elevator, but also you want to be as far from other people, strangers in the elevator, as possible, and you want to avoid people having to move past you or you having to move past others. So it was a spatial optimization problem based on those constraints. Now, what's interesting here is that these models have nothing to do with each other, except that they both ostensibly involve elevators. But they're basically completely different models. You could take the model from one thing and the first model and apply it to other scenarios, and you could take the second model and apply it to other scenarios, but they look completely different. The reason is, right, that there are no questions in this prompt. There are no questions at all about what problems are to be solved. There is just a system. And I think this, and I've talked with John Miller, and he was like, yeah, we were really explicit about this. Like, we did this very intentionally when I asked him about it. That the question itself, the questions you're trying to ask about a system are going to determine not just how you analyze a model, but also how you construct the model. What are the features of the system that are included or excluded in the model? And so being really careful about this is important. And it can also sort of highlight limitations to your verbal theory, because you need to know what kinds of outcomes would be useful to sort of validate or invalidate or confirm or disconfirm the theories you have or the questions you're trying to answer. So I do think, models are ultimately really useful. I'm going to talk about get into some specific examples, and then we'll get to coding. So this is basically one of the first successful scientific models, is Newton's model of gravity. Right? In the early 17th century, Johannes Kepler used Tycho Brahe's data, the best available astronomic data, to show not only do the planets orbit the sun and not the Earth, but also that their orbits were elliptical and not circular. So this was a big deal. The question is why? So that's the question, right? We have planets and a sun, and they're orbiting, and they're not perfect circles, they're ellipses. Why are they ellipses? No one knew, right? And so in these early days of Western science, several explanations were proposed, but it was Isaac Newton whose explanation persisted, and this is largely in part because he developed it using a formal model. So the assumptions of the model are really simple. You can imagine just every object has a mass and a velocity, and then the force that changes that velocity is Newton's second law of motion. Force equals mass times acceleration. And okay, so what is the force that changes the acceleration based on the mass? Well, it has to do with how strong a force gravity exerts on things. So Newton derives this universal law of gravitation based on this idea that heavier things would have more gravity than lighter things. and that the force of gravity would diminish with distance and the square of distance between the objects. Now, it turns out James Gleick has a great biography of Newton. This is where I learned this. It turns out that Newton wasn't the only person or even the first person to propose an inverse square law of gravitational attraction. So Robert Hooke, Christopher Wren, and Edmund Halley had also all hypothesized that something like an inverse square law could explain the movement of objects. But Newton is the first to test the consequences of this rule. And he can do this because he also invents, calculus, which allows him to do this easily. But he models this, and he shows that the orbit of a particle acted upon by a force of a much larger object would be elliptical. Technically, he showed that any of the conic sections are possible, but that the most likely scenario here was an ellipse. What's neat is that this model is really simple, right? Newton didn't model all the planets and the moons. They didn't know about all the planets or the moons, right? They didn't know about the asteroid belt. They didn't know about any of the planets beyond Jupiter. He just modeled one sun and one planet. And he didn't even model a sun and a planet. He just modeled 2 point objects, one that was very heavy and one that was way less heavy. But this model shows that when that happens, when you have a heavy object and a light object, you get the light object orbiting the heavy object in an ellipse. And this has been extremely successful, right? Newtonian, even though in terms of an explanation of gravity, Newtonian mechanics have been largely replaced by Einsteinian general relativity in terms of how people think gravity really happens, although I think there's some debate among the physicists now as to the nature of the fabric of the universe, but I don't care. But the model is very successful, right? This is like the moon landing in the 1960s was done not using general relativity, but using Newtonian mechanics. But here's another example, right? Here's a pattern in nature. This is data from the Hudson's Bay Company, which is the oldest company in Canada, established 1670. And this, they were fur trappers initially. This company actually still exists. They don't do quite as much fur trapping, but they were fur trappers. They were trading in fur, and 2 of the most lucrative furs that they were trading were from the snowshoe hare and the Canada lynx. And they kept very meticulous records over how many pelts they were collecting every year. And it looked like there was some cycles where there would be boom years and drought years. Some years, lots of pelts, some years, not so many, of both species. And that these cycles tended to be, they weren't random. They were going up, trending up, and then trending down, trending up, and trending down. And they were phase locked. They were correlated. Why? Right? Unexplained by external factors like climate. So what's going on? Well, the most coherent explanation was proposed by 2 Italians working independently in the 1920s, Lacca and Volterra. And they modeled this using, very simply, actually, using techniques borrowed from models of autocatalytic reactions in chemistry. But here's the idea, right? Just a few key assumptions. Hares reproduce in the absence of predators. So when there are no predators or few predators, hares will increase in number because their food is abundant. You just eat grass and shrubs. Lynx die or migrate, which in the context of a location is effectively the same, in the absence of prey. So when they have lots to eat, they grow in number, and if they don't have a lot of prey, they decrease in number. Now, lynx eat hares, and so more lynx means fewer hares. But of course, when there are fewer hares, then there's less prey for the lynx to eat, so their population goes down. When the lynx population go down, there are fewer predators, and the hare population recovers. When there are more hares, the lynx population can increase, et cetera, et cetera. Unlock and multivariate, you can model this. This is the simplest possible, basically the simplest way to model this. This is just a series of two coupled differential equations, where the terms on the left indicate the rate of change of either hairs or links over time. And the first equation says that hairs and A, B, C, and D are just constants. So just rates. But the population of hairs will increase with how many hairs there are, but they will decrease with the rate of interaction between hairs and links. The population of links will increase with the rate of interaction and decrease just as a natural death rate. How more links there are, the more likely they are to die and not have enough food. And if you plot these out, you get nicely coupled cyclical population curves. Right? Now, this model is, again, very simple. It ignores a lot of details, but it captures something essential about population dynamics. If you really want to do prediction about specific populations, you're going to need to include more details. You're going to need to include things like other predators and prey. You're going to need to include things like seasonality and climate. But as a start, as a baseline for capturing this kind of phenomenon, this simple model does a pretty good job. Okay, one more example. And this is related because we're gonna do models like this. This is the Kermack-McKendrick model of contagion. This is created by Kermack and McKendrick, who were working together in the 1920s to model the spread of a contagion, a contagious disease through a population. So the baseline model here is called the SIR model. S, I, and R are just states that individuals in the population can take. They're either S, susceptible, I, infected, or R, removed or recovered. And the idea is that either they're removed, meaning they've died or gone away, or they're recovered, and in the baseline model, we can assume full immunity once you've recovered. All these assumptions can be relaxed. So here's the basis of the model. When susceptible individuals become infected individuals, they become contact infected individuals, they become infected with probability tau. And then when infected individuals are infected, they recover with some baseline rate, gamma. And you can set this up as a series of three differential equations, couple differential equations, and here's just a typical kind of plot for S, I, and R over time. If you start out with everybody but one person in a population susceptible, and it's a well-mixed population and everyone's interacting at random, then eventually you get this slow increase in infections, and then it will increase over time as more people become infected. They can affect more people. Then it slows down as more people become infected. And then the infected individuals start recovering, and eventually the epidemic is over. And you get this classic SIR response curve. Now, again, this makes a bunch of assumptions that don't always hold in the real world. For example, it assumes that the population is well mixed, so everyone is contacting everyone. It assumes in this version that no new people are entering the population and no one is leaving the population. It assumes that the disease works like in this way, where as soon as you are infected, you are contagious, and that recovery is just a constant probability. So these are all assumptions that don't always hold and can be relaxed in extensions of this model. But it turns out there was a scenario in the 1970s where these assumptions did hold pretty well, which was an all-boys boarding school in the UK. There was an outbreak of influenza, and they quarantined the whole school, so no one was allowed in and out. And they kept really good records of every boy who expressed symptoms and then got better, and how long they were sick for. And the black dots here are the real data, and the red was a sort of very quick and dirty model fit to those data that I did using an SIR model. You can probably get a slightly closer fit, but I just did it quick and dirty. But you can see that when the conditions, the assumptions of the model are met, the model does a pretty good job of showing you what kinds of dynamics are going to ensue. Now, all these are purely mathematical models, right? The Newton's model of gravity, Lacke-Volterra model of predators and prey, Kermick-McKendrick model of contagion. I've talked about these are differential equations. Newton's has one differential equation. Lacke-Volterra has two differential equations. Kermick-McKendrick has three differential equations, but they're differential equations. They're where every term in the model is basically a variable that is the state of some sort of system or population of individuals. So we have one term for all the predators, for how many predators there are, or one term for how many infected individuals there are. And this is it's nice, it's elegant, it gets us a lot, but it also has some disadvantages or at least limitations. One is, and I think the biggest one, is limited realism, right? Math models like these usually assume a lot of homogeneity, that basically everyone in a certain category is the same, that every member of some species or everyone who's infected or whatever are identical. It often assumes that interactions occur purely at random, that the probability of encountering any kind of individual is exactly equal to the number of that kind of individual in the population or the frequency of them, that interaction rates are the same for everyone, almost as if populations were just swirling in a giant gas cloud, right? In reality, especially if you're interested in social behavior, most populations have important sources of heterogeneity, right? People differ in all kinds of ways, both in terms of their inherent traits like personality, age, gender, abilities, proclivities, and also social and environmental affordances, where they are in a social network, where they are in the environment, who they're connected to, right? All these non-random structures are important for certain kinds of dynamics. Pragmatically, there's often a limited intuition. There is a smaller number of individuals who have deep mathematical training, and for people who have there are many people who have like really deep knowledge of a system, but don't have the kind of mathematical training that allows them to meaningfully engage with some of these models, especially the ones that involve sort of advanced math. And that is too bad. And sometimes, it's like, well, we shrug our shoulders and say, well, it's too bad, but it's still valuable to do the modeling. And it is. But also, it's unfortunate because often the insights from the models would be of use. Well, two things, right? One, the insights from the model can be of use to the people who are, boots on the ground in the system and have the detailed knowledge. And also, having those people interact more with the modelers can help us build better models. And finally, there's kind of relatedly, right? There's a higher bar to entry, right? It's if you don't know the math, then it's hard to access these models. And most of these can be overcome at least partially through agent-based modeling, right? For whatever reason, agent-based models, sort of computer programming, seems to be easier for a lot of people than math. I don't know why, but it definitely seems to be the case. So agent-based models are, it's a class of formal models in which individuals, agents, are simulated as explicit computational entities. So these are just some little videos of agent-based models. These are all models I personally have worked on and published just for fun. And in this case, right, each individual is expressed explicitly, so they can have as much heterogeneity as you like. They can have a location in space. They can have properties like age or resources. They can be situated on a social network. And they can have different rules or strategies for behavior. They can have different knowledge. And we can get a lot of things. Now, it doesn't come for free, right? There's a cost, which is analytical tractability. If we have an equation and it's closed, we have the equation, we said x is a function of y, then if we know the value of y, we can immediately just plug that into the equation and get x. Whereas with simulation models, you typically have to actually run the simulations for each case. And some people think, oh well, the math models are just, there's a certain kind of elegance that gets lost. And I'm somewhat sympathetic to that. But there are a lot of benefits to agent-based modeling. And I think those really, for a lot of cases, outweigh the costs. So you can account for a greater complexity in your system, heterogeneity, both of individuals and structure. You can have structures like network structures or spatial structures, environmental structures. And they can help us understand emergent phenomena. It would be really hard to understand something like flocking birds or schooling fish with a purely mathematical model. It's the fact that we have simulated them as explicit agents that gives us the power to understand them and to generate those phenomena. And I think for a lot of people, this is also just technically a lower bar to entry. So the trade-off between these costs and benefits are going to relate to the research questions being asked. There are cases in which it's just easier to do a math model, or cleaner to do a math model, or more general to do a math model. And then there are cases where it's not the case. I also think, right, I want to make another point about this, right? So people talk about math models or equation-based models in these terms. So these are, just like the previous models we talked about, Newton, Lucke, Volterra, Kermit, McKendrick. Equations specify relationships between variables. They dictate the dynamics. They can sometimes be solved precisely. Agent-based models, where we have the agents simulated as explicit computational entities, allowing for greater heterogeneity in structure. I think it's a mistake to think of these things as competing approaches, that you have to choose a side. I have seen these kinds of discussions often in published papers, like this is why agent-based modeling is better than equation-based modeling, or this is why agent-based modeling is stupid and we have to do only equation-based modeling. And to me, I think those arguments are misguided, right? I think these are complementary and not competing approaches. So I'm going to show you an example in which they are, I think, complementary. So this is the Kermit-McKendrick SIR model as expressed in differential equations. We have S, I, and R. This is the populations of susceptible, infected, and recovered individuals. And these are equations expressed at the rates of change of those things, right? So susceptibles just decrease with the rate at which susceptibles encounter infected individuals. All those become infected, so that's the same as the first term in the infected equation is the same thing, but positive. But then infected individuals also recover at rate gamma, and then they become recovered. And we can plot out, this is just looking at the population of infected individuals. This is looking at two infection curves for two values of tau, the transmissibility. Tau is sometimes called beta, if you're an epidemiologist. I have reasons for calling it tau, just because tau stands for transmissibility, and also beta often implicitly assumes also a contact rate, and I'm going to get to that. But this is, if you take these equations and you I've just made some arbitrary values for gamma and tau, and I've plotted the proportion of the population that are infected. And what happens? Well, both times, right, it goes up, lots of infections, and then goes down as those who are infected recover. But when the transmissibility tau is high, and here it's 0.3, I just arbitrarily, right? Very transmissible, very contagious disease. The infection spreads very quickly. Lots and lots of people get infected, and then it crashes and they recover. What happens when it's less contagious or less transmissible? Well, it spreads more slowly, right? And it takes longer to reach the peak, and the peak is much smaller, right? Instead of 45% of the population being infected all at once, we have only about 20% of the population infected all at once. So right, when everyone at the start of the COVID pandemic and everyone was talking about flattening the curve, right, this is what they meant. This is what epidemiologists mean by flattening the curve. Doing something to decrease the transmissibility or otherwise decrease the rate at which the disease spreads through the population so that the infection curve seems kind of squashed, right? And this does two things, right? One, it gives officials or public health people longer. It takes longer for the infection to spread, so they have more time to come up with interventions and solutions. And also it means that at any given time, there are not as many people all sick at once, so we don't overload resources. So this is from the equation-based modeling. And we have this is varying this parameter, tau, which is decreasing the transmissibility. So you can use this to say, well, look, if we can decrease the transmissibility of the contagion, then we'll flatten the curve. Won't that be great? I found in talking to people that people not trained in epidemiology or modeling often had a little bit of trouble understanding how this related to what any of them were doing. Right? How can I decrease the transmissibility at the population level? Right? This seems to be almost an intrinsic property of the disease. And that has to do with the way these equations are written. But let's put this in an agent-based model. So this is something I did this. This is just a population where agents, they're little people here, they're moving around in a two-dimensional space using a random walk. They're just moving at random. And the contagion here is based on spatial proximity, so that if you're susceptible and you encounter, in order to get infected, you have to be close in space to an infected individual. And so in this model, the white agents are susceptible, the red agents are infected, and the gray agents are recovered. And then what I did was a bunch of simulations where I didn't vary the transmissibility of the disease at all. I kept it the same. But what I did vary was how agents move through space. So in one simulation, I said, well, agents can move fast through space. And that's just their step size. Every time they move, they take a big step. So basically, the population moves quickly and individuals interact with many individuals per unit time, many different individuals per unit time. The green agents here, they move slowly. Their step size is smaller. So even though they're all moving and they're interacting, the population density hasn't changed. They basically stay pretty close to where they started for much longer. And so they're interacting with the same people over and over again and not different people. Well, this is basically a very simple abstract model of social distancing or physical distancing. So we can simulate this here. Got our little animations. And in this case, right, what happens here is very similar to what happened when we vary the transmissibility in the math model, right? In the fast-moving population, you have lots of new contexts. So there's always another susceptible individual that eventually will get hit by the infected individuals are moving quickly through the population, basically infecting everyone all the time. That's what happens when we have a big, well-mixed population. In the slow-moving population, we have agents not doing that, right? They're basically staying close and they are moving a little bit. And so the infection is spreading, the contagion is spreading, but it's spreading much more slowly through the population because the number of new people being contacted at any time has decreased. It also is in the slow condition, there are some individuals who never get infected where that never happens in the fast moving condition. And so this kind of thing, I find is really helpful for building intuition about the kinds of dynamics that occur in these systems. I don't think of the equation-based model as better or worse, and I don't think of the agent-based model as better or worse, but they're complementary. You can get insights from both, and the insights from both complement each other. Okay. So in terms of realism, right? There are lots of ways to break down reality, and there is a kind of qualitative difference between, or it's more continuous, but there's a difference, right, between on the one end of the scale, very fine-grained models where we are modeling lots and lots of details about the world, right? These are useful when there is data in the world that can be precisely parameterized in the model. So if we are built, especially when we have a model of a specific time or place or scenario, people are often very interested in these very fine-grained models where the representation is very clearly related to the real system. This is like the San Francisco Bay model. It's a very fine-grained model. And in terms of agent-based models, people use these often when we know a lot of the things about the way the system is organized. So like traffic models and urban dynamic models are often very fine-grained. Some epidemiological models, like if you know exactly the geographical layout of a place and you know exactly where everyone lives and what the probabilities of interactions between different people or communities tend to be, and you know a lot about the time course of the spread of a particular disease, like you know how contagion it is, you know how long it is between when you get infected and when you become contagious, you know how long it takes people to recover. In scenarios like that, people can and do build extremely precise fine-grained models. Often, we're interested in broader, more qualitative patterns, more abstract patterns. And even when we ultimately want to do a fine-grained model, at the beginning, we're often using more coarse-grained models to build up intuitions and baselines. So even if eventually we're going to build something very precise, we still want to start with an abstract sort of coarse-grained SIR model to build up intuitions for the kinds of things that tend to happen. These things tend to be much more generalizable, but rarely produce exact measurements. And so there's this relationship between these two. The models we're going to deal with in this course are going to be more coarse-grained. And then you can work to refine them to make them more fine-grained to fit your specific system. And I'll talk about how to do that in a bit. So I'll end this section, right, with this is a quote from Piet Mondrian, the expressionist painter. The one thing can be known only through another. All wisdom is taught. I think this is right. And I think that models help us by studying models, which are usually almost never the thing that we're actually interested in. But by studying models, we can learn a lot about other things, about the things we're interested in.